All right, well, thank you all for coming to this information meeting about the protocol for reconciliation and grace through separation. So, just to get everybody up to speed on what's going on is, as many of you know, the Methodist Church has had problems with division within the church and the denomination about human sexuality, specifically our position on three particular topics. One, can buildings be used for same-sex weddings? Can pastors perform same-sex weddings? And will the denomination permit the ordination of people with same-sex who are homosexuals? So the current position, and the position that has always been, is that buildings in the United Methodist Church cannot be used for same-sex weddings. United Methodist pastors cannot perform same-sex weddings, and the church does not ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals. And so what that means is, if you admit to being a homosexual, then the church, the people in the ordination process should not ordain you. Whether that's the local, somebody should tell you no, whether that's the local church, the annual conference board of ordained ministry, or the bishop. That's what the official position has been for forever. And so there have been attempts to change it every 4 years at every annual general conference, and those have all failed. In 2016, things were not going the way of the progressives, for lack of a better term, and so a decision was made to table all legislation regarding human sexuality and have a commission set up, and then have a special general conference to deal with nothing but this and deal with it once and for all. So that special general conference was held in 2019. There were 3 plans proposed. The one church plan was the one promoted by most of the institutional church and most of the bishops, and it basically would say every pastor can make their own decision about who they're going to marry, including homosexuals. Every church can make their own decision about whether or not they're going to let their facilities be used for same-sex weddings, and every annual conference can make their own decision about whether or not they're going to ordain homosexuals or not. And then there was the traditionalist plan, which, in my opinion, wasn't necessarily a great plan, but in probably all honesty, there needed to be something that was in opposition, something to vote for that was in opposition to the one church plan. And so most of the traditional plan got passed, not all of it because of some technicalities, and but all in all, the 2019 General Conference was just awful. You wouldn't have known it was a Christian conference. The whole thing was streamed online, and there was just lots of ugliness and name-calling, and it was just bad. And so, while there have been people that have been calling for an end to this for a long time, after 2019, that increased. There were different groups that started coming up with separation plans. And people have talked about separation for a long time. The traditionalists, the ones who want to keep the discipline the same, have mostly been saying the people who are progressive need to just leave, who want to change the discipline should just leave, because they've tried to change the discipline, it hasn't been changed, then you should just leave. But the problem in all this is that our denomination, along with some other older mainline denominations, have what we call a trust clause. Members are free to come and go as they please. Pastors are free to come and go as they please. But if congregations want to leave as a whole, it is extremely hard because of the trust clause. And the trust clause basically says that the church owns their property in trust of whatever annual conference you belong to. So if a church tries to leave, the annual conference has a claim on their property, and so that makes it hard. Some bishops are gracious and they let their churches leave, and churches have left. Some bishops are not, and they make their churches pay for their property if they try to leave. Churches that have debt, actually, that's a good thing if you're trying to leave, because if you leave, then the annual conference gets your debt, and the annual conference doesn't want your debt. So generally, if you have debt, you can negotiate an exit. So the trust clause has been the main thing. So all the different groups, traditional groups, all the different progressive groups came up with different plans for wanting to leave. They are listed on the sheet here. The only one that I want to touch on is the Orange Plan, and the only reason I want to touch on that briefly, it's called the Indianapolis Plan, is because that was the only one that was made with more than just input from one group of people. They tried to get 15 people. They tried to get 15 traditionalists, 5 traditionalists, 5 centrists, and 5 progressives, and only 2 progressives would come. But it was called the Indianapolis Plan, and that was promoted by the Wesleyan Covenant Association. So all this is going on. In the background, unbeknown to a lot of us, is there was a bishop named John Yambusa from Africa, Sierra Leone, I believe, and he decided to discreetly get together a group of 15 people from across the theological spectrum, 5 centrists, 5 traditionalists, 5 progressives. And he was able to get them together, and they got on the same page about wanting to come up with a plan to leave, to separate, come up with some sort of division of the denomination. So eventually what happened is they got far enough down the road that they brought some bishops in because they knew there was going to need to be buy-in from bishops. And no separation plan has ever been endorsed by any bishop, or at least not by a group of them. So what they ended up doing was they ended up whittling it down to each of those 3 groups of 5 people whittled down their people to 2. So there were 6 people total, 2 traditionalists, 2 centrists, and 2 progressives. And then they brought in some bishops, and then a man named Lee Feinberg, who is a Washington lawyer and mediator, who has mediated some big things like the 9/11 Victims Fund and the Sandy Hook Victims Fund, the school shooting in Connecticut. He volunteered to mediate our dispute for free. He did completely pro bono. And so they ended up with about 16 people total. So there's 6 people from across the theological spectrum plus bishops. And they had bishops from the Philippines, they had bishops from Africa, they had bishops from Europe, and they had bishops from America. Including our own Bishop Harvey, who is now the chair of the Council of Bishops. He was one of those 16 people. And so basically they negotiated, and Lee Feinberg led them, and what they came up with was this, what we simply call the protocol. And it's the pink column, and the other columns are just kind of unnecessary at this point, but I already had this paper printed off and couldn't find anything that summarized it quite so good. So what the protocol is that the plan is separate. They were supposed to vote on it in 2020 at General Conference, but the 2020 General Conference didn't happen. So in the protocol is basically what is going to happen is a new traditionalist denomination is going to form. So the traditionalists are going to leave and form a new denomination. So one of the problems with all of this stuff about the future of our denomination is the United Methodist Church is such a complex legal organization at this point, it is almost impossible to split it up. And the United Methodist Church almost has to continue to exist legally until it dies. There's no way to just split it. It's just so too complicated. So somebody was going to have to leave. So it was decided that the traditionalists would leave. One, because the centrists and the progressives control most of the institution, and so they get to keep. They already have it, so they get to keep it. 2, a lot of the American traditionalists don't care about the institution, and they feel like the name's already been soured. And 3, the third and probably the top reason why the traditionalists are leaving is because the traditionalists had already been kind of laying the groundwork to leave. And so they were, while progressives have talked about leaving, traditionalists were farther down the road. And so it would be easier for them to leave and start over because they'd already started the groundwork in the form of the Wesleyan Covenant Association had already laid the groundwork. So that's why that decision was made. So what's going to happen is if the legislation is passed, then immediately after the General Conference where the protocol is passed, a group of people will file paperwork with the United Methodist Church to form a new traditionalist denomination. The United Methodist Church has agreed to give the new traditionalist denomination $25 million for payment over the course of 4 years as IC money. How they came to that is they decided it was too difficult to buy the liquid assets, but they decided that the liquid assets of the United Methodist Church are just over $100 million. And so $25 million of that will go to the new traditionalist denomination. Another $2 million is being set aside in escrow for any other group that wants to leave and form another denomination. There are some progressive groups that are still talking about leaving, saying the United Methodist Church not moving fast enough for them. There might be other smaller groups that might want to leave, so $2 million is being put in escrow for them. And then also a further $39 million is being set aside specifically for United Methodist Church ministries, current United Methodist Church ministries that target non-white people. So whether that's Africa or the Philippines, but it's not for any ministry to white Americans or white Europeans. Part of the thinking of this and why this was agreed to is because a lot of the reason the African church is still with us, still with the United Methodist Church, is because they cannot financially support themselves. And just honestly, they will admit that. That's just the truth. There have been a lot of international parts of the United Methodist Church that have left over the years. Some of it's because of theology, and some of it is they can support themselves and they don't need the United Methodist Church anymore. The African church still does from a financial standpoint. Now, to their credit, most of the Africans are traditionalists, and they said, you're not going to hold us hostage for money, but that's just reality. So the people who get to administer the $39 million will be people who are left in what they're calling the post-separation United Methodist Church. They will administer that fund. So that's $39 million plus $25 million, which is $64 million, plus another $2 million. So of the just over $100 million of liquid assets, $64 million is being set aside. So the post-separation United Methodist Church, it is anticipated they will have some financial difficulties after this happens, because it costs a lot to maintain the bureaucracy that we've created in the United Methodist Church. So how this is going to work is that the denomination, people will get together and create the new traditional denomination, and then the central conferences, which are the big regional conferences outside, will have 6 months to vote on whether or not they want to join the new traditionalist denomination. That they have to vote, and it has to be a 2/3 vote about whether or not they want to leave or not. And they will have 6 months to make that decision. They can decide anytime within the 6 months. Annual conferences will have a year to decide if they want to join the new traditional denomination or not. The margin for an annual conference to leave would be 57%. And then there will be a 3 or 4 year period in which local congregations will have a choice about whether or not they want to go to the new traditional denomination or not. And that vote will be simple majority. Well, actually, the church council can decide what they want that to be. The council can decide what they want that margin, but it can be as low as 50 plus 1. These votes do not have to happen in a particular order. As soon as the protocol passes, churches can vote to leave. As soon as the protocol passes, annual conferences can vote to leave. They don't have to wait for the body above them. If an annual conference votes to leave, then all the churches will go with them, and then the local churches will have to vote. If the local church doesn't want to go to the new traditional, then they will have to take a vote to stay in the post-separation United Methodist Church. So that. Oh, and within those 4 years that churches have to choose, the trust clause will be suspended, meaning that you will leave and there is no negotiation. You get to take everything with you. You get to take your money, you get to take your buildings, you get to take your property, and nobody can stop you. But this provision is only good in the context of leaving for a denomination set up under the protocol. So churches will not be allowed to leave and go independent. You'll have to leave for a denomination that's set up underneath the protocol. The New Traditionalist denomination or some other denomination. All right. I think that's it on what the protocol is. So now I'll take questions, and then I'll talk to you about what the new traditional denomination will look like.
What guidance has the Louisiana bishop given you and other Louisiana ministers?
They put out information about the protocol, but they've given us no guidance on how to handle it or what to do. They've asked us. I've been asked by the DS where I fall and where I think my churches fall in all this. They've asked for that information that they say they strictly use for appointment purposes, because at this point they're not that they weren't doing that beforehand, but they're really getting into matching up pastors and their appointments. Now, the problem is at this point is there are probably more traditional churches than there are traditional pastors. So there's an imbalance there. But we've got no guidance. I know that the Louisiana Wesleyan Covenant Association initially with the 2020 timeline was going to push for a vote on the annual conference leaving as soon as possible to see if we could get the whole conference to go. That was seemed to be a close vote in 2020, but the 2020 timeline was May is when General Conference is going to be, and then Annual Conference is going to be in June. So there's only a month. But now General Conference is scheduled for September of 2021, and Annual Conference won't happen again until next summer unless a special session of Annual Conference is called, and the bishop has expressed no interest in calling a special session of Annual Conference to vote on whether or not to join the traditional denomination. So I don't know what, so the likelihood is there probably won't be an attempt made to take the annual conference to the new traditional denomination, just because there are probably enough churches that are tired and want to leave immediately and won't stick around long enough for an annual conference vote, and it would dilute what the traditional voting block at annual conference.
What does the bishop do about the voting? The Louisiana Conference voted to leave. Did she go on the conference or stay with it?
Yeah,
I'm assuming she believes.
Pastors and bishops make their own decision about where they're going to go and what they're going to do, and they have their own timeline on when that has to be done. Sorry, I didn't think that earlier. What? So if they decide to leave, there's going to have to be some transitional time where, and everybody's kind of agreed on this, where if you have churches and pastors who are not matched up on what they want to do, there's going to have to be some time where, there's allowed, where you're going to just have to be together for, 6 months to a year while things are kind of sorting themselves out. Right. So, and I'll get into how pastors are appointed will change in the new traditional denomination, and I'll get to that in that section. Yes.
My question will be in that section. Will the new
the Wesleyan Covenant Association will not be the new traditional denomination. The Wesleyan Covenant Association sees itself at this point as a midwife to give birth to the new traditional denomination. But the Wesleyan Covenant Association plans on ceasing to exist within the next couple of years. Like if the initial timeline had gone, had been in place, it's highly likely the Wesleyan Covenant Association would not exist today.
Okay. And when, I say when we go through the Methodist Spiritual Church, how are the pastors going to handle their healthcare and clinics?
So, West Path is who handles our pensions. And West Path it used to be the General Board of Pensions, and they changed their name to something cooler called West Path, so I don't know why, the branding. West Path will continue to administer pensions for any denominations that come out of the protocol. They are willing to work, and there's accompanying legislation that everybody's kind of agreed on that will allow West Path to do that. Now, the healthcare that's a gray area because the healthcare is done on an annual conference basis. So I don't know, it'll depend on whatever your annual conference does, I would imagine whatever they do, it'll be cheaper because we can't get more expensive than what we're doing right now, healthcare-wise.
What about our apportionments? How will that be affected?
Apportionments will go down. They're talking about apportionments being as much as 10% of what they are currently.
Wow.
And the reason why is because the bureaucracy is staying. So we're not funding the bureaucracy anymore. So if you go to the new traditional denomination, apportionments are talking about being as low as 10% of what they are now. We're not talking about if it's going to go down, we're talking about how much it's going to go down.
Has consideration been given to the anti-Christian environment in the political and politics in the United States, the possibility of increasing taxes, like taxing the 25 million?
No, and I hadn't been even talked about. All right. So we're ready to move on. I'll tell you what I know about the new traditionalist denomination. So the new traditionalist denomination, like I said when asked, is not going to be the Wesleyan Covenant Association. So what has happened since is it has come to the attention of the different traditionalist groups that there are many traditionalists that never have openly identified with the Wesleyan Covenant Association, Good News Magazine, or the Confessing Movement, or any of the other traditionalists. And so an effort was made, called by the leader of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, Keith Boyette, who's a minister out of Virginia and a lawyer, and the bishop of the Texas Annual Conference, which is Scott Jones, and the Texas Annual Conference is East Texas. It's Houston and almost all the way up to Texarkana. And he's a traditionalist. And they got together a group of people from the Wesleyan Covenant Association, from Good News, and from people that had never been, who were traditionalists but had never been an open member of any traditionalist organization. And they got together in Atlanta, and they basically have formed a transitional leadership council to transition to a new traditional denomination. So we don't know who all is on this council because people are afraid of getting of reprisals. Some of the people have come out and said they're on it. There is an African American minister from New Orleans who is on the transitional council. His name is Joe Connolly. He is in charge of our denomination's church plant in, I believe, the 7th Ward. So I think all the 7th Ward churches were destroyed by Katrina. And so, but I know Joe's on that council. So what the council is doing is basically the council is working to create a transitional denomination that will be ready to go the day after the protocol is passed, so that churches who want to leave immediately will have some place to go. And so this transitional council is working on a transitional rules document about how things are going to work. And then either probably late 2022 or early 2023, the very first conference for the new traditional denomination will be called, and every church and every annual conference that has already voted to leave will have an opportunity to have representatives at this convening conference, and then they will finalize the new denomination. So some of the things that they are talking about that we expect to be a part of that is 12-year term limits on bishops, which there already are. There are some term limits on bishops, but no more than 12 years. And then when you're done being an active bishop, instead of being a retired bishop, you go back to being a local church pastor, the same as any other local church pastor. So there will not. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work out, but this is what they're talking about: is DSs will no longer be full-time positions. That each district will have 20 to 30 churches, and the districts and those churches will get together and they will elect one of their pastors as the district superintendent. And there will be a 12-year limit on how long a pastor can be a district superintendent. There will be some additional pay involved in that, but district superintendents will be part-time.
So how long is a bishop a bishop now?
So right now, a bishop is a bishop for what? So there is DSs have 6-year terms, a maximum of 6 years, where you can get 2 years of extra DS-ship for whatever reasons. But then you have to go off, but you can go back on. I know there's a pastor in Louisiana who's been a DS twice, but there are 10, 20 years in between his time as DS. Well, and I'm not having trouble seeing how a part-time DS is going to work. I mean, I think it's nice. I'm just not sure how realistic that is with workload. I mean, it would mean that the DS would have to be a pastor of a smaller church to be able to be the DS. So, yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing is, when asked about earlier, is appointments. So right now, appointments are made by the bishop exclusively in consultation with the district superintendents and the PPR committee, or whatever functions as the PPR committee at the church. In the new discipline, what they're talking about doing is there will be 4 different groups of people that have equal say, and if one of them says no to a proposed move, then it doesn't happen, and they got to go back. So the 4 people would be the bishop, the DS, the PPR committee, and the pastor who would be making the move. All 4 of those people have equal say, and all 4 of them would have to agree if a pastor is going to come to a new church. And any one of those 4 can put the kibosh on a move. So that's
everybody lost you in, you don't really have a choice.
now.
But no, the new one.
Now the new one, you have a choice. And now you don't have a choice.
Oh, now it's 3, and then it's 4.
Well, now it's the bishop. The bishop is supposed to consult with the church and supposed to consult with the DS, but the bishop has final and only say when it comes down to it. If you're an elder, you have zero choice. You can, sometimes they might give you some. I'm not an elder, I'm a local pastor, so I'm in a gray area where I'm full-time, so I'm supposed to go wherever she tells me to, but since I'm a local pastor, I do have a little bit more power than an elder does, which is interesting. So that's how appointments are going to work. The other thing is, we talked about apportionments. The other thing that I can think of that's a huge deal that they're talking about that we all need to be aware of is historically, membership in the United Methodist Church and the Methodist societies required membership in the class meeting. So the way Wesley had it set up was there was a Methodist society, which is, if you think of a congregation, there was a class meeting, which was a group of 10 to 12 people that you went to every week, and there were bands, which were groups of 2 to 3 people. Class meeting was required membership for the church. In fact, admittance to church, to the society meeting, was on a ticketed basis. And you got your ticket by going to class meeting. And if you didn't go to class meeting, you didn't get your ticket for society meeting. And so when Methodism came to America, it would work that way. When we became our own church, membership in the church required membership in the class meeting. And it was like that right up until just before the time of the Civil War. So there is significant talk of bringing back that as a membership requirement. They're not calling it the class meeting, but they're talking about making membership in a small group, a small accountable discipleship group mandatory for church membership in the new traditionalist denomination. They do have a plan to phase that in because, let's just be honest, most churches aren't doing that. But that is, and I don't think that's bad. And the conversations I've had with people, a lot of the pastors that are of the same mind don't think that's bad. But how you manage those expectations when that hasn't been an expectation since before the Civil War, and how you transition churches that haven't been doing that into doing that is something that's important and has to be watched at. But that is something that there's significant talk about doing, is making a requirement for membership in the new traditionalist denomination, membership in a small accountable discipleship group. That could be a Sunday school class, it could be whatever, it could be a lot of different things. But that is something that they're very seriously looking at.
Is that similar to like the children really need to a running and not work for this calendar?
Right.
Linear class curriculum, and then we have the senior book, and then we go to church. And then as an adult, you can, talk to them or whatever in the song. So what you say it will be a like training course as the children receive for education.
Well, no, it would be more of it wouldn't be training, it would be discipleship. Now I have seen that word used, catechism, so they may be bringing that back as well. But no, this would not be like training. You go through certain and you're done. This is a weekly thing, a normal weekly thing that you're a member and a participatory member of this small group, this accountable discipleship group. You could change groups, but it's not something that you can. Right. No, it wouldn't be just 6 weeks. It would be ongoing. Right. I imagine there will be easy ways that you could make an existing Sunday school class or Bible study group function as what they're talking about. Again, I don't think it's bad. I just think, that it's different, and it's, how do you transition that? So, I think the only other thing I would say is that there is still a lot of interest in the traditionalist denomination being a part of being a truly global church. There are some of the Methodist denominations that have left from other countries talking about reuniting with this new traditionalist denomination. So we think I think that's a good thing. That's something interesting. One thing I forgot to mention about the protocol is, and I'm sure people are going to ask about how people from Africa feel about it. I believe that the protocol was written in such a way as for the United Methodist Church to basically purge itself of American traditionalists and keep the people from Africa, because they think the Africans want the money. I don't, that's what I believe. I don't know, I don't know that to be true, but that's what I think is true. There are a lot of bishops in Africa that are like our bishops, we're finding out, that are not on the same page with their people in the pew, if you can imagine that. And so Africa was not supportive of the protocol at first, for understandable reasons, because most of Africa is traditionalist, and so the United Methodist name has not been sullied, as it has, as some traditionalists would view it has been in this country. And so they were upset that they were not going to get to keep the United Methodist name. But they have eventually come around. But like I said, I think this was created to get rid of the traditionalists in America and not necessarily take the traditionalists in Africa with it. People have asked, another common question is people ask, why is there the different percentage in having the threshold and leaving for annual conferences and the central conferences outside the United States? The simple answer to that is that the progressives wanted the threshold to be 2/3 for everything, for every group, for churches, annual conference, central conferences. The traditionalists wanted to be simple majority for everybody, annual conferences and central conferences as well as local church. They agreed on a simple majority for local churches. They agreed on the 2/3 for the central conferences, and they could not agree on annual conferences, and it was threatening to blow the whole thing up. It was the last thing. Lee Steinberg came to them and said, look, this is the last deal. I'm going to take my privilege as the mediator, and I'm going to set the annual conference threshold at 57%. Take it or leave it, and if you leave it, then you have to explain to everybody why you blew up the whole deal for this one thing. He really said that to them. And so that's how we got those numbers. Is the progressives got one they wanted, we got one, the traditionalists got one they wanted, and then Lee Steinberg set the other one and said, take it or you blow the whole thing up.
So, this move that you're going to make, is that up to 4 years?
Well, you have local churches in the original timeline had 4 years to decide. The thinking is that the people at the central conference and annual conference level know what's going on and are aware of what's been going on for the past 40 years, and so they can make a decision pretty quickly. A lot of people at the local church level don't know what's been going on, and so there might be time needed for information to filter down to all the local churches. Now, as far as getting the new traditionalist denomination set up, it should be fully set up by early 2023. They will have a new traditionalist denomination, a transitional denomination ready and set to go day one after the protocol passes, assuming it passes, and then we're talking late 2022, early 2023 for it to be finally officially set up.
So we're talking about a year and a half.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and then February 20th is they are supposed to release the name by the end of the month and the logo. Right. Well, they're going to release the name and logo in the next month, or before the end of the month. The other big thing is February 20th is they're going to make a decision about whether or not to keep annual conference or general conference in September or not. There are significant concerns about COVID still, and probably more importantly, there's concerns about whether or not the delegates from outside the United States will be able to get in. You got people from the Philippines, you got people from Africa, and you have people from Europe, and I think that's really the issue. And so on February 20th, the decision is supposed to be announced about whether or not they're going to postpone it again, which pushes everything back again, or if they're going to try to go to some sort of virtual format, which is hard because the Philippines and Africa aren't the most technologically advanced places on earth. And so not everybody has access to the internet. And so they're working right now to try to see if there's some way they can do this virtually. Otherwise, it may get kicked down the road again, which is frustrating to everybody. So, I mean, we should already be done and past most of this stuff by now. Or not. So. All right, any other questions? Any questions? All right. Well, I thank y'all, and y'all have a good rest of your day. And I'll post this on the internet later this afternoon or early this evening.
We'll have to get new hymnals.
Oh, come on, stop. Well, so that you're funny you say that, because Palestine just